Good evening and welcome. I'm Mike Munoz, Superintendent, Rochester Public Schools. Thank you for coming tonight. Before I turn it over to Dr. OShea to give you the research on the need for sleep, especially for our older students, a little bit about what we've done. We've been working on this for the last couple years. If you've kind of followed this along, we tried to do a partnership with the city, busing and using the city buses for our high school and middle school students. As we got through the process, we found out there's going to be about another $6 million annually for our transportation budget, and felt that's something that we could not afford. So we got a task force together, and they've been working for several months, and tonight they're going to share the two options that the task force has come up with. We're going to ask for your feedback on those two options. If you're parents, you probably this week received a link for a thought exchange. We're also doing a thought exchange to get feedback from parents as well. And then the students, I think this week, we're working with the high school administration to do a thought exchange with the high school students so they have some input on the two different options as well. Tonight, as I said, you're going to hear the research. We're going to present the two options, and then there's some forms. There'll be some forms on your table later that we'll ask you to complete as a table. But if you want to complete your own form, you're welcome to do that as well. And then at the very end, we're going to open up a thought exchange so you can actually respond using your devices tonight, and we'll show you how to do that. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to the expert.
All right, well, thanks, Mr. Munoz, and thanks to the Rochester School District. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak. My name is Robert OShea. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those who don't know me, I work in the Mayo Center for Sleep Medicine, and I'm one of several physicians there who sees adolescents, so adolescent sleepiness is a very familiar subject for me. A little bit of background about school start times. There's actually a very significant history with Minnesota in that the Twin Cities was the first. There are a couple of districts in the Twin Cities were the first to enact late start times. And this is actually in the mid-'90s, and it was actually also the first group to do research on the effects of that change. Virtually all of, well, not all of which, but all of the academic and health-related, all of the outcomes that pertain to adolescence were very favorable. And the pioneer in that area is Kyla Wallstrom, who's an education researcher at the University of Minnesota, and one of her articles is included in the table. I guess the even bigger news now is that I think there are something on the order of maybe 300 or so school districts in the U.S. that have enacted later school start times for high schools. And then, of course, you may have heard recently that the state of California actually signed into law that none of their high schools can start no earlier than 8:30. I don't know how long it takes to phase that in, but that has been signed into law. So what I wanted to do in the brief amount of time I have, and I think there will be a little bit of time left for questions, I want to just talk about the changing sleep schedule of adolescents. Really the biological underpinnings of the changing sleep schedule, because there obviously are other reasons that adolescents are up late. I want to talk about some of the consequences of sleep restriction, why we care about this issue, and then finally go into the impact of later start times on adolescent sleep behavior and performance. So this first slide shows sleep needs over the life cycle. And I would guess that these first couple of rows here aren't too surprising when you look at the sleep needs of newborns, infants, toddlers, and children. The one that might surprise you a little bit, when you look at the average sleep requirements of adolescents, that's usually defined as ages 14 to 20. So for our purposes, high school students, maybe late middle school students, they require on average slightly over 9 hours of sleep a night. So despite the fact that we think of them as young adults in many respects, their sleep requirements, which in turn reflects brain development, is really more similar to their elementary school counterparts. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, became aware of adolescents as a high-risk group for sleepiness maybe about 20 years ago, and they've been funding studies and doing serial observations of this group. One of the really important survey studies they did was the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And in that survey, when that data was analyzed, a very large number of participants, they showed that the optimal amount of sleep, as I mentioned, appears to be over 9 hours, but there seems to be a real tipping point once you dip below 8 hours of sleep a night in terms of at-risk behavior. So when they looked at the data, the adolescents that were receiving at least 8 hours of sleep a night, that they exhibited a lower rate of marijuana use, alcohol use, cigarette use, and that even sexual activity declined by 10% when they subdivided that data. Probably not surprising to anybody in this room are that most adolescents don't get that amount of sleep at night. When they look at survey data, this is from the CDC and the risk survey that I just mentioned, less than 8% get the recommended 9 hours of sleep a night, and insufficient sleep, as defined as less than 8 hours based on the risks that I mentioned, is prevalent among over 2/3 of responders. And then maybe most sobering on this slide, although not at all unheard of, particularly with the patients that myself and some of my colleagues that are here see in the clinic, that 26% of adolescents report a typical sleep time of 6.5 hours or less, which I think even for an adult population is pretty punishing. So just taking a step back and thinking of the things that govern when we fall asleep, at least the biological factors that determine when we fall asleep. This is called a two-factor model, and this blue line here represents the homeostatic sleep drive. So as soon as you wake up, a sleepiness begins to accumulate, and that can actually be measured in the brain by a chemical called adenosine, and not surprisingly, caffeine serves as an adenosine antagonist. Up until the age of about 6 months before circadian rhythms are developed, the infant will just function on homeostatic drive, which is why they just fall asleep, wake up, fall asleep, wake up. They don't care what time of day it is. Once the circadian drive for wakefulness develops, in an ideal world, this is a simplified model. There are some dips here, like during siesta time. But this drive for wakefulness will counteract this drive for sleepiness. And when that drive for wakefulness dissipates, sleep can occur, sleep onset, and wakefulness can occur at a relatively regular time. In adolescence, as I'll show you in a moment, there is an eveningness or a night owl tendency that occurs on a continuum. In clinic, I'm seeing people that fall at the extremes of that end, but there is a biological eveningness preference that develops and shifts this circadian output to the right. So adolescent brains are much more sleepy during morning hours and much more alert during evening hours as they go through puberty. There's I usually find the most convincing way to demonstrate this. There are a lot of questionnaires that assess this emergence of this night owl tendency with adolescents, but this is a physiologic study. And what they did in this study is on the y-axis here is the degree to pubertal development. So a stage 4 Tanner would be a fully developed adolescent. And on the x-axis here is we're measuring melatonin levels. These are measured in saliva. And these melatonin offset times, melatonin is a darkness hormone in the brain. And so the time that this melatonin stops secreting can serve as a timing of the individual's circadian clock. And if you plot these points mathematically, there's a pretty good correlation here between pubertal development and the degree to which an individual is a night owl, physiologically speaking. This is a very busy slide, but I can simplify it, hopefully. This is a very large survey study from a group in Rhode Island from Brown, who does a lot of this research on adolescent sleep. And I should say that the data that I'm showing here has been duplicated in numerous industrialized countries. But this is a group of students where there's a regularly fixed rise time because of an early school start time. And during that same period of time, the older the child is, the later he or she falls asleep. There seems to be something as you go through pubertal development that at full development, there seems to be kind of an average sleep onset time of about 10:45 p.m., 10:45-ish. So they have a hard time falling asleep before that time. So since these school rise times are fixed, this is school night TST, or total sleep time. You can see that the amount of sleep decreases, and all of these sleep times are well below the optimal amount of sleep that we'd like to see these adolescents receiving. You can see the same trend on weekends. It's just that these sleep time decrements are less dramatic because the kids are able to sleep in. This is a study done by that same group, and there's a test we do in the sleep center, an objective measure of sleepiness, where we measure how long it takes an individual to fall asleep during a 20-minute nap trial. It's called a multiple sleep latency test. And an abnormal result would be considered falling asleep in 8 minutes or less. So this is the same group of kids, and in this particular school district, the school start time is an hour and a half earlier, so pretty punishing for these kids. So during the first 8:30, so during the corresponding to the first period of school, roughly, there's a pretty normal value on this to be 10 minutes. But just with that same group, just switching to that earlier start time of an hour and a half, their degree of sleepiness here is akin to what you'd see in someone with narcolepsy. 5 minutes or less is what you'd see in someone with narcolepsy. So they're essentially asleep during that first hour of school. And a relatively small number of subjects in this study, but I think very compelling data. So so these kids are sleepy, who cares? Well, there's actually a lot of reasons to care. We know that sleep restriction is associated with depressed mood in adolescence. I already talked about the increase in at-risk behaviors. Adolescent drivers in general, probably in part because they're inexperienced, cause over 50% of fall asleep crashes, and I'll show you some data that shows that the sleepiness of adolescents can actually increase that number. And then poor academic performance is also associated with chronic sleep deprivation. So the same person, the researcher at the University of Minnesota, she got a grant from the CDC to study school start times in 3 different states, including Minnesota, I think 5 different school districts and 8 different schools, or something like that. And she was able to look at the various start times of the schools in comparison. And when we think of that number as a minimum of 8 hours as being sufficient sleep for these adolescents, we can see that the later the start time, the higher percentage of students are achieving that 8 hours of sleep a night. So there's really a dose-dependent relationship. The more time you allow for sleep, the more sleep they get. That's a little bit counterintuitive. When back in the 90s, when these start times were changed in the Twin Cities, a lot of skeptics thought that the students would just go to bed later, but it turns out as a group, by and large, that the students do use the extra time to sleep, as was also replicated in this study. When they looked at the effect on behavior in this study, they duplicated a lot of the results that I mentioned previously. Among the 9,000 some students who participated, those who slept at least 8 hours a night were less likely to report symptoms of depression. They were less likely to fall asleep in class. They were less likely to drink caffeinated beverages. That's when caffeine addiction usually starts in adolescence. And they were less likely to engage in risky behaviors. I mentioned the car crash data. This study also, during the school year, September to May, they were able to access the 3 states' departments of public safety records. And they found that after the change to the later start time, in comparison to the schools that didn't, the number of car crashes in the 5 districts studied decreased by 13%, this adolescent car crashes. The reductions ranged significantly. The greatest reduction was seen in the school district in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which had the latest start time of 8:55 a.m. So again, there seems to be this dose-dependent relationship. School performance, in relation to start times, in the schools that changed to 8 to 8:35 a.m., those school districts, there were statistically significant increases in the first period GPA and 1 or more core courses of English, math, social studies, and science in 3 districts with start times within this range. There were 4 districts with those start times where they didn't find that increase in GPA. But again, in the school that started latest, the Jackson Hole at 8:55 a.m., they found significant increases in GPA in all first period core courses for all semesters and all grades. So pretty compelling data. Based on all this, it shouldn't be a surprise from a health perspective that all of the relevant medical societies and health organizations have issued policy statements that endorse a high school start time no earlier than 8:30 a.m., and that was also what occurred in the state of California. Just to summarize, adolescent sleep debt is largely a result of biologically mediated sleep time delay and early school start times. Sleep deprivation has serious negative consequences. Later school start times appear to have the ability to improve these health and academic outcomes. And clearly my task here is just to present the medical and the health research. There's a lot of moving parts, and I'm interested to hear the rest of the talk. I'm also a stakeholder. I have 2 kids in high school. So I appreciate your attention, and if we have time for questions, I'll take them.
I might have them so people at home can hear. I'll give them this, and if
Okay.
you can
Yeah.
respond.
Yep.
Okay. Who had a question?
I have one question.
Wait, so people at home can hear your question.
Okay, my question, most of your chat, at least I was a little bit late, dealt with kind of older kids. My question is, what's the earliest you would recommend a start for elementary school?
I think elementary, trying to think when my kids, elementary school now starts quite late. And so I know the kids are, I'm kind of pulling, that actually hasn't been studied as much. So I think it's not identified as, that group isn't identified as a high-risk group for sleepiness. So I know that in some of the places that have enacted this change, they just swap times. So, so the elementary school students would start at 7:40 or 8 a.m.
Elementary school kids will get up early, no matter what. So for high school kids, their wake time is important because of that delayed bedtime. For elementary school kids, their bedtime is important. And they could probably start school at 6 a.m. and be fine because they're up then. So.
And that's one of my pediatric sleep colleagues. So. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Did you study parent satisfaction with the kid having to go to school at 6 o'clock in the morning?
We wouldn't be doing 6.
Yeah.
Just saying.
I think it was a joke.
Going on record. It wouldn't be at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Did you have any other questions?
So I know this was done for schools. Mic up, all right. Has any research been done for standardized testing? Because I know this weekend I'm taking the ACT and we have to be in there at, I think, around 7:30. Would this also affect standardized testing in any way?
One would think so. That hasn't been studied. I think my understanding, I'm not an education researcher, but it's pretty hard to study at least grades, and I would think that they would be able to access that data, but to my knowledge, that hasn't been studied.
So you said there was a thing signed by major medical societies to not have school start times any earlier than 8:30. What would you say is the optimum time for it to start? Like if there were no real restrictions?
I think a lot of that is there's kind of this balance between. From a professional standpoint, I don't think it should start any earlier than 8:30. If you look at that data, the school that started at 8:55 was the latest, but there's a lot of moving parts and logistics. So I don't think I could answer kind of where that sweet spot is, but I personally, based on that data, would favor it not starting any earlier than 8:30 a.m.
I just want to respond to the SAT question. In Edina, studies showed that for the higher performing students, SAT scores went up by over 100 points.
There you go.
With after the switch to later start.
Do you have any data on autistic kids with special needs? Is there any difference in their requirements biologically or otherwise?
I don't know of any data, but two of my pediatric sleep colleagues are here, and perhaps they know the answer to that.
Kids with special needs do have different sleep requirements and often have difficulty going to sleep and staying asleep. And so again, I think they're probably a separate category. I don't know of any studies looking at that specific question about how school start times impact their performance. But they're a heterogeneous group, and they for sure have different sleep needs. I don't know if you have anything to add. Yeah.
All right.
All right, thank you again.
Thank you, Doctor.
All right, next up is Scott Sheridan. He kind of facilitated the task force that studied this for several months, and he's going to go over the options. Heather will be passing forms to the tables. After each option, it's 4 questions. What are the strengths you see in that option? What are the weaknesses you see in that option? What questions do you have about that option? And then the last one is ideas for improving that option. So we'll bring those and put them on your table. We'll give you time as a table to talk, but if you want to fill out your own sheet, have at it. That'd be fine. You going to stand there or you want to do this?
I like to move around, so I'll just use this. What a great attendance here. This is fantastic. I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. We didn't know what to expect. Hopefully we have enough handouts and things for everybody to utilize, read, take home with you, whatever you choose. My name is Scott Sheridan. I'm the Executive Director of Operations for the school district. One of the divisions that I oversee is transportation, and so I was kind of tasked with setting up the task force. However, all the real experts was everybody else that was on the task force. That included representatives from middle school, high school, elementary, REA president, HR, that had to go over the contracts regarding times, special ed, student nutrition services, community education that runs the SAC program. So we had a real gamut of people that were on this Bell Time Study Committee, and we met for about the past 9 months, not every month, but fairly regularly, and in between times they were tasked with looking things up and bringing it back to the meetings that we had. So I'm going to quickly try to go over it. I apologize for how small it is, but you can imagine that one of the first things we recognized that there were a lot of considerations that we had to take into account here, because if you move one little start time, that trickle-down effect relates to everything else that's occurring. And so, and the key to one of these as well is we had the representatives from the athletic department or the activities directors as well, because that played a significant role. But we had the medical research, as Dr. OShea talked about. The American Sleep Association recommended middle school, high school no earlier than 8 a.m., but most of the other research, as Dr. OShea said, indicates that 8:30 is about the standard, the consideration not to start from middle school, high school earlier than 8:30. from the transportation perspective, what I want you to keep in mind is like I said, every movement in start time has a trickle-down effect. We did, as the superintendent talked about, try to look at a single tier, but it was cost prohibitive, so we're back to a two-tier. And what I mean by that is, like our current system is that the buses come, pick up middle school, high school, drop them off, and then they return and pick up the elementary and drop them off. And to do that, we need about an hour in between to make sure that we can do that. If those times are crunched, then we're going to need more buses in order to accommodate the number of students. And so I also want you to keep in mind we do transportation for the private schools as well. We're responsible for all the transportation for all the students within our district, whoever lives in our district, whatever schools they attend. Not all of them. There are some schools that opt out, private schools. They can opt out of our transportation, but for the most part, we transport all the students in our district. There's child care concerns, of course, for parents for the pickup and drop-offs as well. The after-school activities was one of the mitigating factors that were really hard to overcome. We have middle school students that participate in the high school athletics. So if you have high school getting out earlier than middle school, how are you going to start a practice? Are you going to wait to start the practice till the middle school kids get there? Or if it's the other way around, what do we do with the middle school kids while they wait for the high school to get out? Out-of-town events, a lot of them, we're participants in the Big Nine, and we also do other events up in the cities and even further. And if it's on a school day, kids have to get on the bus, get the travel time to wherever they're going. They have to have warm-up time, and then the event would occur, and we have to get them back home. If we have to get them out of school earlier in order to get there, that's a concern. If we have a later end time at the end of the day, they're going to be missing more school at the end of the day for those that participate in after-school activities out of town and to go to those events. We had to look at those considerations as well. A lot of our coaching staff, some work in the elementary, some work in the middle school, some work in the high school, and if they're coaching at the high school level, if the elementary doesn't get out till 3:45, how do we get those coaches to the middle school, high schools if they got out earlier than that? Or if you flip that around, what does that do to those coaches as well? And of course, the practice start times are delayed until we can get all the participants there to do the practice. And of course, we have a limited ability with fields, ice rinks, swimming pools. Those are all under consideration. Okay? School-age child care, this is something that we'd really like to hear about. Some of our staff members that work in SAC are high school students. So if the elementary kids get out prior to the high school kids, how are we going to staff SAC for those employees that are supposed to be there to help support the SAC? If you flip it around the other way, let's go back. If the elementaries get out earlier, our parents are going to appreciate having their child in a SAC program for an extended period of time in the afternoon until you can get off work and pick them up. Or when you flip it around, or would you rather have them earlier in the day in SAC and then go to school all day and then get out of school earlier in the elementary? These are all things that we looked at. Student nutrition services. If you start the elementaries too late, some of our elementaries are rather large, and we don't have the capacity to the cafeteria ability. They have to. Some of our larger elementaries have 6 lunches. Federal law says they have to have at least 15-minute seat time to eat, and most elementary schools do a 20-minute lunch and a 20-minute recess. So if you start your elementary students at 9:45, some are eating lunch about 10:30, almost 45 minutes after they get to school. So how do we accommodate all that? These are all considerations we need to take into effect as well. So those are the considerations, and like I said, there's a trickle-down effect for every decision or every option that we looked at. So we did the best we could. We were tasked looking at 2 different ways to do this. We were looking at a cost-neutral way to do it, and then another one that was a little more expensive, but would the school board support it? of course, that's the board decision to make. And this is option one that we came up with. And I believe it's on your tables as well. The high school right now starts at 7:40, but now we could push it to 8 o'clock. It would reduce a couple minutes during the day in passing time, reduce some time in the lunch at the high school level, and we can get them out at 3:10, which is just about 7 minutes later than what they do right now. So that would help with the after-school activities and the busing. And the middle schools would be about the same, 8 to 2:40. They have a shorter day anyway. And then elementaries would start at 9:20 and get out at 3:40. That gives us that hour between the middle schools getting out at, or the high schools getting out at, or middle schools at 2:40 and the elementary at 3:40 for the busing. So these are the impacts that we found with this option one. It wouldn't have as much impact on special ed transportation we do, because we do about 85 vans that assist with special ed transportation. Bus transportation costs with option one would be about neutral, which would mean no cost increases. The middle school would be reduced about 10 minutes, and I already explained the elementary impact on the lunch. But the 8 a.m. satisfies some, but some of the research, but a lot of the other research still says the 8:30, so we haven't achieved that. But this is what we did that would be the best we could come up with that was be about cost neutral. I'll put that. Sure. You want me to run that? Oh, thanks. You want me to take the time now?
Hi, there was information in the stuff that was sent out prior that talked about how there might be some impacts to needing more resources at the schools, more para support, more teachers, things like that. Was the cost estimate of that ever guessed at?
That wasn't one of the considerations that we made on that, no. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, I can tell you most of the support that we have, they're contracted to be when kids are in session, so it doesn't really matter what time they start or end. Their hours are when students are in, so I don't see it be too much of a increase in staff, because when kids are there, they have to be there.
Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, now what we're looking for, we really want your input. This is your opportunity here. If you want to talk amongst yourselves at your tables too, if you could write some suggestions, ideas, and if there are other questions that pop up regarding option one, just let me know. And Heather Nessler, who's our Executive Director of Communications and Technology, she's kind of the driving force behind all this, set a lot of this up. She'll be around to answer questions. I can answer questions. And I know the superintendent will as well. For about 3 to 5 minutes.
5 minutes. And for the people that are watching at home, there is a link at the bottom of your YouTube channel so that you can complete the form online, and we will be reviewing all that feedback as well.
Thank you.
I have one question that might affect more than just me. On the current Rochester School District start and end times, there are several schools that are listed starting at different times than what they otherwise would have, elementary, middle school. So I have kids that go to Lincoln which is an elementary / middle school. My question is how these proposals or options affect that.
Yeah, there is some wiggle room in there with the start time. Those aren't set as for each elementary that has to start at that time. You're correct. There would be some adjustments made for most of those are district-wide option schools. Yes, it's a good question. Yes, sir.
I guess my question is looking at both of these plans, why not just switch the elementary and the high school start times?
It's an excellent question, and so pay attention for option two. But it's a good question.
I'll answer that real quickly. Right now, we start picking up secondary students, I think, at 6:30 in the morning. Not sure we're going to pick up a kindergartner at 6:30 in the morning at the bus stop. So that's I get that a lot. Just do a quick flip. Well, I wish it was that easy, but we couldn't just flip because we start picking up kids too early. All right, we'll give some time. Let's hold on to questions. If you have questions, we'll just come around and answer them individually.
Let them know that they can keep working, but we want to be true. We want to be careful of their time.
All right, thank you. Some fantastic questions. Hopefully we got a lot of them answered. We'll stick around to answer those questions. You can keep working, but I'm just going to go over option 2 as well now, just so you see. Option 2, this is the second option that was presented to the school board, and this has a high school start time at 8:44 in the morning with a dismissal at 3:15. You'll notice that the lunch is reduced to about 44 minutes. Right now it's 50 minutes. The juniors and seniors at our high schools have open campus, which allows them to leave the campus and go off-site, eat lunch, then come back. They would be limited a little bit more now by about 6 minutes or so if we reduce their lunch time. There are shorter class times at the high school because we're packing it into an 8-hour day, but those classes are just a little shorter. Middle school, as you see, would start at 8:45 as well and get out at 3:35. Lunch started at about 11 o'clock, which isn't too bad, but their last lunch would be at 1:35. And that day is shortened by about 10 minutes. Elementary then would start at 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock in the morning. And a lot of the questions that I had were, well, what's the earliest pickup time with our buses? And our first pickup is about an hour and 10 minutes before the start of school. So on an elementary student, the earliest pickup would be about 6:50 in the morning. And as you know, if you're up at 6:50 in the morning now, it's just barely beginning to get light out, and it's getting longer and longer until December 21st, then it starts reversing back. So that is a concern, of course, having elementary students out, those that would get picked up that early, at their bus stops in the dark with the sun just coming up. And so these are the impacts that we had. Now, the cost is the impact on this one. One route for a bus costs about $50,000 or about $53,000 somewhere, depending on how long it is. And based on our assumption, because we have that crunch time from an hour down to 45 minutes in between the two tiers, that it would require about 10 more buses that we would have to hire in order to get all the students where they need to be at the time. So you multiply that times the $55,000 for a bus route, and you have about $500,000 or more annually to accommodate option 2. We don't know about, the impact on the van sped routes because it's difficult to plug them in. We don't know how many we're going to have every year anyway. It kind of varies in cycles depending on that. So we weren't able to determine if there was. But my transportation manager is confident that there would be an increase in cost there as well. After-school activities may be extended at the high school because, as it says, the middle school gets out at 3:35, the high school gets out at 3:15. They have to wait on the practices to start for those middle school participants that potentially are playing at the high school level. You see a lot of middle school students that participate in some sports that are actively participating at the varsity level, cross-country teams. A lot of the younger athletes, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, or 7th and 8th graders are actually on the varsity in the swim teams, the cross-country, and track, and other sports, of course. But so we would have to wait about 20 minutes for them. Transfer sites. This is important that I want you to consider as well. Right now, our transfer sites, where all the buses that are transferring students come and gather, are at the high schools, which have ample parking, a lot of space. If we went with option 2, the transfer sites would now be at the middle schools. And for those that have students at the middle school, you know how tight it is, particularly at John Adams and Kellogg. And if we add more buses there to be able to try to do the transfers, we would really have to reconfigure how we do that.
By transferring means some kids may get bused to high school and then get on a different bus to actually go to their school.
So, and you have the other concerns up there as well. So I don't want to take too much time, but I know some of you have already been talking about option 2, but I just wanted to reiterate what those the impacts that we had as well. Would you like me to leave the impacts up there so you can review them? Okay. Absolutely.
So I don't have a sense of, with the school budget, is $550,000, relatively speaking, is that a lot of money? I don't have a good sense of that. I mean, for a school, school budget.
We have a little over $300 million annual budget. So $500,000. John is what percent? John's the money guy, number guy.
1%, he says. I believe our transportation budget annually is about $10 million. Heather, well, did I answer that question that you asked? Okay, thank you. All right, if you want to, yes.
What percentage of RPS secondary students are varsity athletes?
When Jeff Whitney, who was the activities director for Mayo, he was on our panel, he said that about 40% of high school students participate in after-school activities at high school. I think that's what he meant, was the 40%. You don't believe that's right? Okay. I'm just quoting what Jeff said. Maybe you're right. It does assume all activities. Did you have a question? Yeah. Sure.
So I know for the swim team, at least, especially at Mayo High School, that the practice time doesn't start until 4 o'clock, meaning that even if this was to take effect, it's still, as of right now, about an hour and a half for high school or for middle school students to get from wherever they are, which in this case is either Friedel or Willow Creek, to get to Mayo, which is a lot of time in between. And I know for the Century swim team, which as of right now is practicing at Mayo High School from, I believe, from 6 to 8 o'clock. That's, again, a huge amount of time in the window. So I'm just wondering how that would affect.
I'm not sure it would affect. I do know if we build a new pool at Century, like we're planning to, that it should help that later start time. But thank you for that information. That's very important.
Yeah, I had a question about if the task force or the panel looked at some of the districts up in the cities that also have athletics and after-school activities and see how they structured it.
Yeah, one of the things, it's kind of difficult to compare us to the cities because we have a 212 or 219 square miles we have to cover every day to pick up kids, whereas in the metro area, that's all it's much easier because they don't have as far out to go. But we have not looked at what extracurricular activities done, but me personally, I think those things can be worked out. I mean, we already have kids, like you just heard, we have kids that practice late. I know we have some teams that the only time you can get ice time is before school. I mean, so that part wouldn't be new to us. The only piece that might be new is we may have a few more kids missing that last period when they have to travel to a game. We have some now already, but this could increase a few more with that up. So we want to make sure we have time to give you time to fill out. You should have gotten a new sheet, so we'll give you time to do that. And then I think Heather's going to talk a little bit about the thought exchange we'll put up, so we'll give you a chance to do that as well.
Thanks. Pardon if I'm naive about it, but I'm just wondering, does the high school start time have to be linked to the middle school and the elementary school? In other words, could one leave the elementary and the middle school start times as is and just initially tweak the high school start time? Granted, that is going to be more expensive, but that's really the group which is most vulnerable to the effects of sleep loss. So does that make sense? Or maybe I'm off base.
It does, but then we'd have to go to a 3-tiered system, and that $500,000 would be even more, because we would have to have a route for elementary, route for middle, and a route for secondary. So we didn't look at that.
I know this is so hard to cost out, but the cost to society of a child with mental health problems who gets admitted, or a child who has an accident related to sleepiness, and those costs are really enormous. And I granted there's societal costs and not costs directly to families and school, but I just don't know how to sort of factor that in as well.
I appreciate your opinion. Unfortunately, I have to make decisions. Money has to be part of the equation. So, all right, we'll give you time to fill out your sheets, and then Heather will put up the thought exchange, and you can use your devices and provide some input that way as well.